everybody. Okay, so I'm going to continue, I guess, the series of answering questions and stuff from the Friendly Atheist. So, I'm on 57, 58, and 59. I think those are the ones I'm answering. Oh, almost done, I suppose. Well, maybe. Okay, so the first one is, of course, if, what was it? Oh, yeah. Do I really believe that Mary, the Mother Mary, was a virgin after getting pregnant? And, sure, why not? I mean, yeah, if you believe God exists and that's the narrative of the Bible, and you believe the God of the Bible, then why not believe it? I suppose this is going off of the Humean idea that if there is a miracle and it's more probable that the miracle does not happen, that it does, then the more logical conclusion is just to not believe it, to assume that the person's lying rather than the laws of nature have been suspended. And okay, I guess you can view it that way if you're an atheist, but again, it all goes down to your assumption whether or not you assume that God exists or you assume that God doesn't exist. Because if I were to assume God doesn't exist, then of course I'd be saying, yeah, no, obviously it was just her lying, but if you assume God does exist, then that's more of a possibility. And if you assume the God of the Bible exists, it's a very high likelihood that it actually did happen. So, you know, it goes ultimately it's just you have two mountains, and these two mountains are two worldviews. Obviously, I'm on one mountain, and the atheist is on another, and it's in order for us to have a good conversation about these things and come to any sort of conclusions or understand each other a bit better, we need to build a bridge. But you can't build a bridge from the top of the mountain, so you have to build a bridge from the very bottom of the mountain or as close as possible. And I think that's what I try to do when you figure out what the basic axioms are, the most fundamental presuppositions, which really don't have any real rationale for them, like any reason. Because ultimately, after you answer the why questions, like why do you believe that? Okay, why do you believe that? And why do you believe that? Ultimately, you get down to the point where there is no actual reason for why you believe certain things. It's more of just an assumption. And it's okay to have assumptions, everyone does. Um, no one is free from a lack of assumptions. I think that's grammatically correct. Later, I'll figure that one out. But either way, the point is, if you assume God exists, then, well, if you assume the God of the Bible exists, then the Mary thing is perfectly okay to believe in. And if you assume that God of the Bible doesn't exist, well, then the opposite is true. There's no real historical documentation for or against. There's more just arguments about what I just mentioned. At least from what I've seen, I haven't seen any historical documents for or against. So maybe I'm wrong. I'd be open to see those. I have read the various apocryphal books of the New Testament, and I think that those are generally not trustworthy. I think they're pushing a particular agenda, a particular Catholic agenda. But who knows? Again, I'd be open to their validity if it's proven that they are valid. The next question is, if someone came up to me and said that they were pregnant but they were a virgin, would I believe him? And the obvious answer is no. Why would you believe someone if they tell you that they're a virgin and they are pregnant? And it's the same thing in the Bible. Joseph didn't believe that his betrothed woman was still a virgin, and it took a divine intervention to actually get him to believe it. That's the narrative of the Bible, and so I think it's pretty reasonable to, even on biblical grounds, not assume that everybody who's pregnant is still a virgin. So, going off of that, Oh, also, it was pretty much prophesied. There's a bit uh, of not textual variance, but there's a bit of debate on the prophecies in the Old Testament regarding the virginity of of uh, of the I forgot where's Isaiah somewhere 11, 16, I don't know, one of those places maybe, of the virgin birth, or the supposed what's supposed to be prophesied as a virgin birth. And of course, I'm sure many people who, or anybody who's watching this, might be familiar with Christopher Hitchens. He debates this, as well as pretty much the entire Jewish community. They debate this point that the word virgin really just means a young girl, or you could say a young marriageable girl. So yeah. Unfortunately, during the time of the Septuagint, when the Septuagint was written, of course, everyone I suppose knows that the Septuagint is the Old Testament written from Hebrew to Greek. It's, I think, the first time that something like this occurred, where they wrote the Old Testament into a different language, or at least, maybe not the first one, because I know there are the Targums. But either way, it's one of the first times, and of course we all know the story. The 70 rabbis were all put into separate chambers and forced to write or translate the Old Testament into Greek, and they came together, and they were all like practically identical. Okay, and the issue is in the verse where it says, "A virgin shall bring forth a child." It is translated into the Greek word that means a virgin who has not slept with anybody. So there's that. Plus, in the Hebrew, there's a I don't know if it's a midrash. I'll have to figure out the correct terminology, but there's a saying that the word which says virgin, it has a mem in it, and that's the word m in the Hebrew. And the mem has two forms. It has a non-final form and a final form. The final form is like a box, and the non-final form has some little opening in it. And the mem means water, and of course, this the mem also has to do with womanhood in a way, to a degree, for those reasons. And whenever the mem is in the middle of the word or in the beginning of the word, it's a non-final form, obviously. And if it's at the end of the word, it's end of the word is a final form. But here, in the word that says virgin, or the verse that says a virgin will bring forth a child, it has the closed mem in the middle of a word that means that has been interpreted by rabbinic literature, not Christians, to mean, and this was before Christ, to mean that an actual virgin will bring forth a child. That's why they translated it that way. So yeah, you have those. And the final thing, why did God have to rape a 16-year-old girl in order to become a human? And I think this is, well, I mean, it's a stupid question. Well, a stupid way to put the question, but the question is a good question. Why did God have to come in the form of a human through a human host? Like, why did he have to be born into the world? Why couldn't God just, bam, lightning from the sky? No one would ever doubt that this is God. And there are a couple things. For instance, one rabbinic tradition prior to Jesus is that there are a bunch of messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. Some of them have the genre of the Messiah coming on a donkey. Some of them have the genre of him being, or the theme of him being on a horse. And of course, the horse is the warrior; he's a king. And then the donkey is more of like the suffering servant. And this was before the newer interpretations in the Talmud. But either way, there was sort of a, I don't know how widely it was accepted, but there was sort of a belief that the if the nation of Israel was worthy, then he would come on a horse and he would redeem them from whoever's oppressing them. If the nation of Israel is not worthy, then he would come on a donkey and he would save them from themselves so that they can be worthy, so he can come back on a horse. Or they believed in not two comings, two messiahs, one coming. So one messiah, two comings. It's a different thing that Christians believe. So anyway, the point is, why did he have to come through a human? Well, it's so he could be a human um, in his entirety. And right now, don't mind me, I'm just making this up on the fly. I can probably figure out a better way to discuss this, or I'll think more about this later. But it seems the idea to me is that Jesus had to sort of come into the world through a human in order to redeem humans, uh, because humans, and I think this is what Paul is referring to, because humans have brought sin into the world, and Paul says, of course, that through one man sin entered into the world, and through one man sin left, essentially. So the idea is that Jesus, he had to come as a human does come into the world. But unfortunately, when the norm, actually no, they still so disregard what I was about to say. But what I said before is still my thought process. He had to come into the world as a human, the way humans do, and then he had to live life as a human until he died, and then he could finally become more than human, I suppose. That might be the idea, and I'm not. There's a word. I'm not going off into heresy land, because there's a heresy that actually believed that in more literal terms. What I'm saying is that he had to live like a human completely until he died, uh, when he could start to more fully express his divine will, I believe. In anyway, that might be a possible answer to that. Um, all in all, though, it's a good question, and I don't really. I mean, it's a good question to think about, but I don't see how that in any way defeats any sort of God argument. It just is questioning God's methods rather than His existence. Yep. So I have sort of a challenge. It's not really a challenge. It's completely off topic of this, but it's something to think about. As if there are materialists out there, um, and if there are materialists, and this is a genuine question of mine because I struggle to find the answer for this coming from a materialist perspective. So if there are genuine materialists out there who are listening to this, and they might want to take up this issue, and they're well read into the literature of identity from a philosophical perspective. I want to know how they can sort of manage all of the issues with identity from a strictly materialistic perspective, and sort of just to manage them, because uh, there are a lot of issues there. So yeah, I'd be very interested to hear their answer to that. And the reason is because I started listening to this lecture series from, I forgot who the professor was, some professor, and he is attempting to prove, coming from the dualist or the natural, I think it's just naturalist, so dualist and naturalist perspectives on consciousness. And he's of course a naturalist, and he's trying to prove that naturalism is a better method, or not, a better theory for uh, everything: consciousness, life, soul, death, all of that sort of stuff. But he fails to mention so far anything on consciousness, or sorry, on identity. So I'm wondering if anybody has any resources, or they have any way that they actually cope with the issues from a naturalistic identity standpoint. So yeah, I'd be happy to hear your guys' points of view. Have a good day. Bye.